The order came through a back channel, not through official MACV command structure, not through the chain of command that governed every other operation in Vietnam. General William Westmoreland, the commanding general of United States forces in Vietnam, a man who had publicly and repeatedly championed the overwhelming firepower doctrine that was consuming American lives at a rate that made the nightly news unwatchable back home, did something in the autumn of 1966 that his own staff would later describe as completely out of character. He picked up a secure phone, bypassed 3 layers of his own command architecture, and called the Australian Task Force headquarters at Nui Dat directly. He had a mission. It was the kind of mission that American commanders had learned, through expensive and bloody experience, that American units could not accomplish without triggering contact, without generating noise that compromised the objective, without producing the kind of operational signature that told the enemy something important was coming before it arrived. Westmoreland needed it done quietly. He needed it done completely. And he needed it done by men whose methods he did not fully understand, but whose results he had stopped being able to explain away. He needed Australians. What happened after that phone call was never formally documented in American after-action reports. The operation itself remained classified for decades. But the pattern it represented, the quiet, unofficial back-channel trust that senior American commanders placed in Australian SAS capabilities throughout the Vietnam War, is one of the most consequential and least examined stories of the entire conflict. Because what those generals were doing when they made those calls was not simply requesting Allied assistance. They were admitting something that their public statements, their congressional testimonies, and their official operational philosophies flatly contradicted. They were admitting that the most powerful military force in human history, with its 500,000 soldiers and its helicopters, and its B-52s and its artillery and its limitless budget, could not do what 5 Australians with small packs and no radio could do in the dark. General William Westmoreland is the figure most associated with everything that went wrong with American strategy in Vietnam, and that association is earned. His search and destroy doctrine, his body count obsession, his public confidence in a war of attrition that the evidence consistently suggested was not attritioning the right side, produced operational and strategic failures that are now studied in military academies worldwide as case studies in institutional blindness. But Westmoreland was not stupid, he was not unobservant, and whatever his public positions required him to say in briefing rooms and press conferences, his private operational behavior told a different story about what he actually believed when the cameras were off and the careers were not on the line. David Hackworth, who commanded the Hardcore Battalion and who had developed the most direct and most documented American understanding of Australian SAS methods through his practice of sending his own officers to train at Nui Dat, wrote in his memoir about FACE that Westmoreland's private assessment of Australian capabilities was considerably more candid than anything he ever said publicly. The generals knew, Hackworth wrote. They all knew what the Australians were doing and what it meant. They just couldn't say it out loud without admitting that everything they'd built their careers on was wrong. That observation, from the most decorated soldier in American military history, is the foundation on which this account rests. The American generals quietly trusted the Australian SAS with the hardest missions because they knew what David Hackworth knew and could not say what David Hackworth said. To understand precisely why the hardest missions went to the Australians, you have to understand what made a mission hard in the specific context of the Vietnam War. Hard did not mean dangerous in the conventional sense, though the missions were always dangerous. American units faced danger every day, and accepted it as the fundamental condition of their service. Hard meant something more specific and more operationally precise. Hard meant missions where detection before execution meant total failure. Where the noise signature of a conventional American patrol, the helicopter insertion audible for miles, the radio checks every 30 minutes. The chemical signatures of soap and insect repellent drifting through jungle air would alert the target before the mission reached its objective. Hard meant missions requiring extended undetected presence in territory the enemy controlled completely, not for hours but for days, sometimes for weeks. Hard meant intelligence gathering that required watching and waiting with a patience, and a silence that the American training system had not produced and could not quickly replicate. Hard meant the kind of operations where the gap between what doctrine said was possible and what the specific environment required was so large that only operators who had spent years closing that gap could bridge it. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment had spent years closing that gap in Malaya and Borneo before they ever set foot in Vietnam. The American generals understood this, even when their public positions required them to pretend otherwise. And when the mission parameters required it to be done correctly rather than to be seen to be done, the phone rang at Nui Dat. General Creighton Abrams, who replaced Westmoreland as MACV commander in 1968, and who brought to the role a more honest private assessment of what the war required than his predecessor had publicly acknowledged, developed a working relationship with Australian SAS capabilities that went deeper than the back-channel requests of the Westmoreland era. Abrams had watched the operational statistics coming out of Phuoc Thai Province, the Australian area of operations, with the specific attention of a man who understood what statistics meant when they defied the models that everything else was producing. The kill ratios were the most visible anomaly: 1 to 10 for American Army units in the same theater, 1 to 500 for Australian SAS patrols. Pentagon analysts had initially flagged these numbers as reporting errors. The ratio was mathematically inconsistent with any operational model the intelligence community possessed. Abrams knew they were not reporting errors. He had read the field assessments. He had talked to officers who had observed Australian operations firsthand. He understood that the numbers were accurate, and that their accuracy was an indictment of everything the American approach had assumed about how to fight this war. In his private communications, declassified decades after the war, Abrams described Australian SAS capabilities in language that never appeared in any of his public briefings. He called them the only force in theater that truly understood the environment they were operating in. He called their methods irreplaceable for the specific category of mission that required undetected extended presence. And he called the American failure to learn from them earlier one of the most expensive institutional mistakes of the entire war. Abrams said these things privately. He never said them publicly. The institution he commanded could not absorb the admission that a small Allied contingent had spent the entire war doing something his own forces could not replicate. The specific missions that were quietly directed to Australian SAS through the informal channels that both commands had developed by 1967 and 1968 fall into categories that the official operational histories only partially document. The most consequential category was long-range intelligence gathering against high-value command targets. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army command structure in the southern provinces operated from base areas and underground complexes that American aerial surveillance, photo interpretation, and electronic intelligence had consistently failed to accurately locate. The failure was not technological. The Americans possessed the most advanced reconnaissance technology in the world, and they applied it with genuine commitment and enormous resources. The failure was environmental. The triple canopy jungle of Phuoc Thai and the adjacent provinces defeated aerial observation with a completeness that no photographic technology of the era could overcome. Ground sensors planted along approach trails detected movement, but could not distinguish between small animal passage and human patrol. Electronic surveillance intercepted communications, but the Viet Cong had learned to minimize radio traffic in areas they knew were being monitored. The intelligence gap that resulted was not a gap that technology could close. It was a gap that could only be closed by human beings on the ground, in the jungle, undetected, watching and waiting with a patience and a silence that extended days beyond what any American unit could sustain. The Australians could close that gap. The phone calls from American command to Nui Dat were, at their operational core, requests to close it. One of the most extensively documented examples of this pattern involves the location and subsequent destruction of a Viet Cong battalion command element operating northwest of the district town of Siem Moc in early 1968. American intelligence had been attempting to locate this element for weeks. Aerial surveillance had been flown repeatedly over the suspected operational area. Ground sensors had been implanted along every viable approach route. The official assessment from American intelligence, produced after this extensive and expensive effort, listed the area as cleared of significant enemy presence. An SASR patrol was tasked with a reconnaissance mission in the same area. The patrol included a tracker whose capabilities had been developed through the integration of Aboriginal tracking knowledge that the SASR had been incorporating into its doctrine since the Malayan. Emergency. Within 48 hours of insertion, the tracker had identified signs of heavy recent human passage that the American technology had produced no indication of. Not a visible trail. The Viet Cong were too skilled for anything that photographic intelligence could detect, but there were signs that a trained tracker could read with precision. Vegetation moved and replaced incorrectly. Bark disturbed at human hand height in darkness. Compression patterns in leaf litter consistent with laden human foot traffic rather than animal passage. The patrol followed what the tracker called an invisible highway for 3 days, moving at a pace so slow that it barely qualified as movement by any conventional military standard. On the 4th day, they located a sophisticated underground complex housing an estimated 200 enemy fighters, completely invisible from the air. Exactly where American intelligence had said nothing significant existed. The coordinates were passed to American headquarters. B-52 bombers reduced the complex to overlapping craters. Secondary explosions from ammunition and fuel storage continued for 6 hours. The American intelligence community documented the strike as a success without publicly accounting for the fact that their own weeks of intensive technological effort had failed to find what an Australian 5-man patrol with a tracker had found in 4 days. Colonel Francis Kelly, who commanded the 5th Special Forces Group in Vietnam, and who was one of the American officers most directly engaged in the joint operational arrangements between American and Australian forces, documented his assessment of this pattern in a series of reports that circulated through special operations channels in 1968 and 1969. Kelly was not a man given to institutional modesty. His professional reputation rested on the capabilities of American Special Forces, and he had spent years building those capabilities with genuine commitment. But Kelly's operational honesty was stronger than his institutional loyalty, and his reports said plainly what the back-channel phone calls had been implying for 2 years. There are specific mission categories, Kelly wrote, where SASR capabilities represent the only reliable option available to the command. American units, including special forces, cannot consistently achieve the level of undetected extended presence that these missions require. We can approximate the doctrine. We cannot replicate the consistency. Kelly went on to recommend the establishment of a formal joint operational framework that would integrate Australian and American special operations capabilities in a way that matched mission requirements to the force best equipped to meet them, rather than defaulting to American units regardless of mission suitability. The recommendation was received, reviewed, and filed in the bureaucratic location where inconvenient truths went to avoid disturbing institutional assumptions. But the informal practice it was recommending continued regardless of whether the formal framework was established. General Julian Ewell, whose name is more commonly associated with Operation Speedy Express and its devastating civilian toll, was simultaneously one of the American commanders who most clearly understood what the Australian methods represented and most deliberately used Australian intelligence products to direct American firepower. Ewell was not a man who lacked operational intelligence. He understood precisely what his body count metrics were producing and precisely what they were not producing. And in the gap between what his public operational philosophy required him to claim and what his private operational behavior revealed, the Australian intelligence contribution was indispensable. Ewell's 9th Infantry Division operated in the Mekong Delta, adjacent to the Australian area of operations in Phuoc Thai. The intelligence flows between Australian reconnaissance operations and American strike assets were, by 1968 and 1969, so thoroughly established as informal operational practice that American planning cells had effectively integrated Australian intelligence products into their targeting cycle without any formal doctrinal framework requiring them to do so. The Australian SAS found the targets. American firepower destroyed them. The arrangement suited both commands. The Australians maintained their operational independence and their doctrinal integrity. The Americans obtained intelligence they could not generate themselves and applied it through the overwhelming firepower that their doctrine required. The arrangement was never publicly acknowledged by either command. It is documented in the operational records that have been partially declassified in the decades since the war. David Hackworth's experience with this arrangement was more direct and more personal than that of any other American officer who documented it. His hardcore battalion operated in the same operational environment as the Australian task force, and his practice of sending junior officers to train at Nui Dat had given him relationships with Australian commanders that went deeper than the formal liaison arrangements between the two forces. Hackworth understood, from direct observation rather than from reports filtered through command channels, precisely what the Australian methods produced and precisely why American methods consistently fell short. He wrote in About Face that watching an Australian SAS patrol prepare for an operation was like watching a different species of soldier get ready to do something that had no equivalent in the American tactical vocabulary. They did not prepare for the jungle, he wrote. They prepared to become part of it. The distinction was not metaphorical. It was the operational difference between a force that understood its environment as terrain to be crossed and a force that understood its environment as a system to be inhabited. Hackworth sent his officers to learn the second understanding because he had watched the first understanding cost American lives that proper preparation would have saved. The generals who called Nui Dat through back channels were acknowledging the same thing that Hackworth was acknowledging in his training arrangements. The American way of war was not working for the specific requirements of this specific conflict, and the Australians had developed something that did. The psychological warfare dimension of Australian SAS operations created a second category of hard missions that American commanders quietly directed to Australian assets. Because the psychological effect that Australian methods produced was not replicable by American methods regardless of resources applied. The Viet Cong designation of Australian operators as Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts, was not merely enemy propaganda or metaphor. It was an operational assessment with concrete behavioral consequences that American intelligence officers tracked and analyzed with genuine attention. Viet Cong units in areas where Australian SAS were known to operate began exhibiting patterns of behavior that American tactical operations could not produce through any available means. Experienced fighters who faced American forces, including American Special Operations Forces, with confidence and tactical competence, refused assignments to sectors where Australian presence was confirmed or even suspected. Supply lines were rerouted at significant logistical cost to avoid Australian operational areas. Local Viet Cong infrastructure, the political cadre, the supply coordinators, the intelligence networks that sustained the insurgency at the village level, began collapsing in Australian sectors, not because they were being directly targeted and eliminated, but because the fear of Australian presence made the routine activities of that infrastructure impossible to conduct with the confidence that their functioning required. American commanders understood that this psychological effect was a strategic asset of the First Order. They also understood that it could not be produced by American methods because the fear that produced it was specifically a fear of the unknown, and American methods were never unknown. The helicopters announced their presence from miles away. The artillery announced its presence from the moment it fired. The body count obsession announced its presence through the consistent pattern of American tactical behavior that Viet Cong commanders had spent years studying and learning to predict. The Australians announced nothing. They were simply there or not there, and no one on the enemy side could ever determine which with sufficient confidence to act normally. That uncertainty was a weapon, and it was a weapon that American firepower, for all its devastating material effect, could not replicate. General Harold Johnson, the Army Chief of Staff from 1964 to 1968, was one of the senior figures in American military leadership who most directly grappled with the institutional implications of what Australian methods demonstrated. Johnson was a man of genuine moral seriousness, a survivor of the Bataan Death March, a soldier whose personal experience of what it meant to be in a situation where doctrine and reality had catastrophically diverged gave him a specific kind of institutional humility that not all of his contemporaries possessed. Johnson's private correspondence from his period as Army Chief of Staff, portions of which have been declassified, reveals a man who understood very clearly that the American Army was not performing adequately in Vietnam, and who was searching, with more honesty than most of his peers, for the reason. The Australian performance in Phuoc Thai Province appeared multiple times in Johnson's private communications as a reference point for what adequate performance in the specific environment of Vietnam actually looked like. Johnson never publicly drew the comparison that his private correspondence suggested he found compelling. The institutional stakes were too high. The army he led could not publicly acknowledge that an Allied force operating with a fraction of American resources had developed superior methods for the specific conflict that the American Army was supposed to be winning. But his private acknowledgement of the gap and his private direction of resources toward understanding and partially closing it reflected the same back-channel trust that Westmoreland and Abrams were simultaneously expressing through their operational phone calls to Nui Dat. The formal training integration that eventually developed between American and Australian Special Operations. Centered on the MACV Recondo School, where Australian SAS instructors were embedded, and on the joint patrol programs that Hackworth had pioneered informally, and that the command structure eventually, partially formalized, represented the institutional acknowledgement of what the back-channel calls had been saying operationally for years. The acknowledgement was partial and belated, and never reached the level of the full institutional reckoning that the evidence warranted. But it was real, and its effects were measurable. American long-range reconnaissance patrol units that went through the Australian-influenced training at Recondo School showed improvement in operational outcomes that analysts found difficult to attribute to any variable other than the doctrinal shift. The units that improved most consistently were units whose commanders had been willing to genuinely accept the philosophical inversion that Australian methods required. The shift from domination to integration, from aggression to patience, from the American instinct to impose the mission on the environment to the Australian understanding that the environment imposed its own conditions on the mission that could not be overridden through technology or willpower. The improvement was real, it was documented, and it was never sufficient to close the gap between Australian consistency and American inconsistency that Kelly and Hackworth and Abrams had all identified, and none of them had been able to solve through training alone, because the gap was not ultimately a training problem. It was a cultural problem, and cultures are not reformed in training cycles. They are reformed, if they are reformed at all, over generations. The hardest missions that American generals quietly directed to Australian SAS were not the hardest because of the danger they involved. They were the hardest because of what their successful completion required. They required the capacity to be unknown in an environment where the enemy had been fighting foreign armies continuously for 30 years and had developed, through that continuous adversity, a detection capability so refined and so comprehensive that every conventional military assumption about what constituted adequate concealment was insufficient. The Americans had spent 20 years building the most powerful conventional war machine in history, and had optimized every element of that machine for an environment where being unknown was unnecessary because being overwhelmingly powerful was sufficient. Vietnam was not that environment. The Australians had spent 15 years building something different. Something smaller, quieter, slower, more patient, and more precisely calibrated to the specific demands of jungle counterinsurgency against a sophisticated and adaptive enemy. What they had built could not be purchased. It could not be replicated quickly. It could not be transferred through a training program or a doctrine manual. It could only be demonstrated. And the demonstration, conducted patrol by patrol in the jungles of Phuoc Thai province across 6 years of Australian operational presence in Vietnam, was so clear and so consistent that even the generals who could not publicly acknowledge its implications were privately acting on them. They picked up the phone, they bypassed the command architecture they called Nui Dat, and the Australians answered and went, and came back with what the missions required, and left no evidence of their passage except the results. That is why the hardest missions went to the Australians, not because American generals said so publicly. Because American generals knew it privately, and acted on that knowledge in the only way the institutional constraints of their position permitted. Quietly, through back channels, in the specific operational language that bypasses doctrine and speaks directly to what the situation demands. They trusted the jungle ghosts with the missions that could not afford to fail, and the jungle ghosts did not fail. The legacy of that quiet trust is not found in any official American military history. It is found in the doctrine, in the selection criteria, in the training methodologies, and the operational philosophies of the American Special Operations Forces that were rebuilt from the Vietnam experience in the decades following the war. Delta Force, formed in 1977, incorporated selection processes and small unit autonomy principles that reflected, imperfectly but recognizably, what Australian SAS had demonstrated in Phuoc Thai. The long-range surveillance units that were formalized in the 1980s drew on patrol doctrine that traced directly to Australian practice. The emphasis on environmental integration, on patience over aggression, on information dominance through invisibility rather than firepower, that characterizes modern American special operations is, in its specific operational DNA, a partial inheritance from what 5 Australians with small packs demonstrated to an incredulous American military establishment across 6 years of a war that America lost and Australia, in its specific operational area, did not. David Hackworth understood this before anyone in the official American military structure was willing to say it. He proved he understood it by sending his officers to learn at Nui Dat, and by spending a decade on the Gold Coast after his own army rejected him for saying publicly what the generals were already acknowledging privately through their back-channel phone calls. The generals trusted the Australians with the hardest missions. Hackworth trusted them with his officers. And then he trusted them with his life, which is the most credible endorsement a soldier can give. The operational mechanics of how the back-channel trust actually functioned on a day-to-day basis have never been fully documented in any single official source. But the pieces exist across multiple declassified records, post-war memoirs, and the testimony of officers from both forces, who are now old enough and far enough from active service to speak with candor about what the formal records omit. The picture that emerges is of a parallel command relationship that operated alongside the official Allied coordination structure, without ever being formally acknowledged within it. Official liaison arrangements existed between American and Australian commands at every level from corps to battalion. And these arrangements produced genuine operational cooperation that was documented, reported, and incorporated into the official history of Allied operations in Vietnam. But the specific category of mission requests that bypassed those official arrangements, that went directly from American general officers to Australian SAS squadron commanders through personal relationships and secure voice communications that generated no paper trail, represents a shadow operational history that is more revealing about what American commanders privately believed than anything in the official record. Major General Tim Vincent, who commanded the Australian Task Force from 1968 to 1969, described the dynamics of these arrangements in an oral history interview conducted in the 1980s with the precision of a man who had understood exactly what was happening at the time and had spent years deciding how much of it to put on the record. The Americans came to us with missions they could not officially assign to us, Vincent said, because assigning them officially would have required acknowledging why they were giving them to us rather than to their own people. So they came informally, and we understood the arrangement. We took the missions because the missions needed to be done and we could do them. Whether the Americans ever formally acknowledged why those missions came to us was their problem, not ours. Vincent's description of the arrangement captures something essential about the institutional psychology that governed the entire back-channel relationship. The American generals who called Nui Dat were not acting from ignorance of what their calls implied. They were acting from a precise understanding of the institutional constraints within which they operated and a precise assessment of what the mission requirements demanded. To officially request Australian SAS assistance for a mission category was to officially acknowledge that American forces could not accomplish that category reliably. That acknowledgement had career consequences, budget consequences, and political consequences that extended far beyond the immediate operational context. A general who publicly conceded that his forces could not do what a small Australian contingent could do was a general who had provided ammunition to everyone in Washington who wanted to question the strategy, the resources, and the leadership of the American war effort. The informal channel solved this problem with elegant institutional logic. The missions got done. The Australians got operational tasking that utilized their capabilities appropriately. The Americans got results they could not generate themselves. And the official record remained consistent with the public narrative that American forces were meeting every operational requirement. Everyone in the arrangement understood what it meant. Nobody in the arrangement was required to say it out loud. The back channel was not a conspiracy. It was an institutional accommodation between the operational truth and the institutional narrative, conducted by professionals who understood the difference and needed both to function simultaneously. Lieutenant Colonel John Soman, who commanded the SASR squadron during its initial deployment period from 1966 through 1967, was the Australian commander who first developed the working relationships with American general officers that would define the informal operational arrangements for the remainder of the Australian deployment. Soman was not a man who sought institutional recognition for what his unit was accomplishing. His operational philosophy, which reflected the SASR's broader institutional culture, placed mission effectiveness above visibility and results above credit. When American commanders approached him with mission requests that fell outside the formal Allied tasking arrangements, Soman's assessment process was simple and consistent. Could the mission be accomplished within SASR operational doctrine? Was the intelligence basis sufficient to plan a sound operation? Did the mission serve the broader operational objective of disrupting Viet Cong capability in the Australian area of influence? If the answers were yes, the mission was accepted, planned, executed, and reported through Australian channels in terms that accurately described the operational outcome, without necessarily specifying the origin of the American tasking that had directed it. The Australians kept their own records. Those records were not shared with the American commands that had generated the original mission requests. The arrangement preserved Australian operational autonomy while accommodating American operational requirements. Soman described it years later as the most professionally satisfying aspect of the entire Vietnam deployment, not the combat results, significant as they were, but the demonstration that a small professional force with a clear operational philosophy and genuine operational competence could maintain its integrity and its effectiveness simultaneously, even in the complex institutional environment of a large coalition war. The back-channel calls from American generals were, in Soman's assessment, the clearest possible evidence that operational reality had a way of asserting itself regardless of what institutional pride required the official narrative to maintain. The specific intelligence product that Australian SAS generated during their extended reconnaissance operations, the detailed mapping of Viet Cong movement patterns, the identification of command structures through behavioral observation, the location of underground complexes that no technology could find, was of a quality and specificity that American intelligence officers found difficult to integrate into their existing analytical frameworks, because it arrived through methods that those frameworks had no category for. American intelligence doctrine in Vietnam was built around technological collection, aerial photography, signal intelligence. and the correlation of these technical products into target packages that could be acted on through strike assets. The human intelligence component of American collection was present but underdeveloped, reflecting the broader institutional preference for technological solutions that characterized the entire American operational approach. Australian intelligence, generated through the extended patient observation of small patrols, moving at speeds that barely registered as movement and waiting in silence for periods that most American analysts considered operationally impractical, produced a granular understanding of enemy patterns and infrastructure that the technical collection could not replicate. When Australian intelligence products were passed to American targeting cells, the reaction was, according to multiple American officers who described it in post-war accounts, a combination of genuine operational excitement at the quality of what they were receiving and genuine institutional discomfort at the implications of how it had been collected. The quality meant the information was actionable in ways that technical collection rarely was. The method meant acknowledging that human fieldcraft, developed through decades of institutional experience and refined through a selection process that the American system had not produced, was more operationally effective in this specific environment than the billion-dollar technology that the American system had built its entire intelligence architecture around. General Abrams, in his private communications from the 1969 to 1972 period, returned repeatedly to the question of what the Australian performance meant for American doctrine and American institutional development. Abrams was a more honest internal critic of American military culture than his predecessor Westmoreland had been, and his private communications reflect a man who was genuinely attempting to understand what the gap between Australian and American performance meant and what, if anything, could be done about it within the constraints of the institution he commanded. His conclusion, documented in correspondence with Army Chief of Staff General William Westmoreland, after the latter had moved from MACV command to the Army staff, was characteristically direct. "We know what they do differently," Abrams wrote. "We know why it works. We know that we cannot replicate it through training alone because the difference is not in the training. The difference is in what they selected for before the training began and in the culture that the training reinforced rather than created. We can improve. We are improving. But the specific operational category, where they consistently outperform us, will not be closed through any program we can implement within the constraints of an army of our size and our institutional character. The most we can hope for is that the specific units we designate for that mission category can approximate the consistency they achieve through enough of the cultural change that the training can produce." Abrams was describing, with the precision of a man who had studied the problem thoroughly, the same gap that Hackworth had identified on the ground and that Kelly had documented in his field reports. The gap between a technique and a culture. The gap that the joint training programs could narrow but not close. The gap that explained why the hardest missions kept going to Nui Dat through back channels that no official history would fully document. The Australian soldiers who received those missions and executed them understood the significance of the trust being placed in them. And they understood it in a way that was characteristically Australian in its absence of public celebration. The SASR institutional culture did not valorize recognition, it valorized results. When an American general's back-channel request arrived at Nui Dat, the response was not institutional pride or political calculation. It was operational assessment. Could it be done? How should it be done? What did the intelligence basis support? What did the terrain and the enemy situation require? The missions that came through back channels received exactly the same professional scrutiny, as missions that came through official tasking. Because the SASR's operational philosophy made no distinction between the institutional source of a mission and the professional standard required to execute it. This professional consistency, the same disciplined assessment and the same operational standard, applied to every mission regardless of its political significance or its institutional origin, is what made the back-channel arrangement work. American commanders could trust that a mission directed informally to the Australians would receive the same professional treatment as a mission directed through formal channels. Because the Australians did not change their standard based on who was watching. They had one standard, they applied it universally. And in an institutional environment where the American command culture had developed multiple standards, a public standard for what the doctrine required, and a private standard for what the situation demanded. The Australian single standard was itself a kind of operational asset that the back-channel calls were, among other things, an attempt to access. The story of why American generals quietly trusted Australian SAS with the hardest missions is, at its deepest level, a story about the difference between what institutions say and what reality demands. The American military in Vietnam said, publicly and consistently, and with the full authority of the most powerful military establishment in human history, that American forces possess the capability to meet every operational requirement of the conflict. The back-channel calls to Nui Dat said something different. They said that there was a category of requirement that the public position could not accommodate, and that the operational reality could not ignore, and that in the space between those two facts, the telephone rang in the Australian Task Force headquarters, and a request was made that both parties understood, and neither party was required to formally acknowledge. Hackworth had tried to say this publicly in 1971, and had paid for it with his career and his country. The generals who had been making the calls for years watched his television appearance and understood exactly why he was saying what he was saying, and exactly why saying it publicly cost what it cost. They had the back channels because the public channels could not carry the truth. Hackworth had the courage to put the truth on the public channel, which meant he lost the back channel and everything connected to it. He bought a ticket to Australia instead, and spent 10 years among the soldiers whose worth he had been the only person in his position willing to openly declare. The generals stayed. The back channels stayed open, the hardest missions kept going to Nui Dat. And the jungle ghosts kept answering the phone and going out into the dark and coming back with what the missions required, and leaving no evidence of their passage except the results. That was always enough. For the generals who called and for the Australians who answered, the results were always enough.